Good morning. Today is Monday. I believe it's May 12th. I would like the topic for today is China. But before I get to China, allow me to editorialize for a couple of minutes. I don't know how many of you listened to Trump's news conference this morning. And whether you're a Trump supporter or not a Trump supporter, if you listen to the news conference and then the questions from reporters, you should be alarmed. We were all concerned about Biden sort of rambling at some point, and you're said to be getting too old and so forth. Well, the ramble this morning by Trump was positively alarming. He had notes in front of him, he read from them, and then extemporized, both about China, about drug prices, and about other things. He rambled. He moved from topic to topic. He often talked total nonsense, and not a question of whether you agree with his policy or not, but he was rambling nonsense. And I think that we are having a serious problem with a president who no longer has all his marbles. This is very scary, and we need to watch it and see how this all unravels. And again, I'm not talking about his policies. I'm talking about his rambling all over the place. And for example, he spent a lot of time correctly on the cost of US drugs being so much higher than the cost of the same drugs in Europe, which is perfectly an appropriate topic. But much of what he says was nonsense. And besides, for example, he unilaterally can change this, which of course he says he's going to do so. I mean, there's Congress and there's laws and whatever. But in the process, he also did things which anybody who was reasonably wise as president wouldn't do, which was to insult and attack our European allies. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Now, it got even worse when he started answering reporters' questions at the end. And one reporter appropriately said, when we have a policy of not allowing asylum seekers into the country, even though according to international law, we ought to be able to process them at least to see whether they have claims to asylum. And we're kicking some asylum seekers out of the country. Why is it that a couple of plane loads full of white South Africans are coming to the US getting asylum? And then he corrected that and said not only do they get asylum, but in fact they will be fast-tracked to citizenship. And the explanation why we're doing this is because he asserted that there was genocide against white South Africans. This is 100% untrue. It is a total invention. There are some land issues in South Africa, and people with very large lands have been asked, and in a couple of instances been told, that the workers Black workers who have worked on their farms a decade ought to maybe get some small acreage off those large estate farms. But whatever the details of all of that is, genocide is not happening in South Africa. South Africa has some street crimes of whites and blacks like we have in New York City, maybe somewhat more so. But to accuse a country of genocide, which is a very serious accusation, is not something that the President of the United States ought to be doing as he's throwing out all kinds of false information. So I listened to the whole news conference in detail, and I found much of it shocking, but also terribly disturbing about the state of the mental acuity and the capacity of our president to address policy issues with some degree of accuracy and some without insulting people, but also not making false claims. Okay, this is the end of my editorial on this. I think we ought to be sensitive to what's going on. And I think I came away from this morning not just, sort of saying, well, I agree with this and I disagree with that, but actually dismayed and shocked at the quality of what was going on and the rambling that was going on, some of it accurate, much of it inaccurate. So, having said that, I just want to encourage us all to pay some close attention to this matter. Okay, so today I want to talk about China. Now you know that there is the 90 days grace period where the United States and China will discuss tariffs. So these 145%, 148%, so forth tariffs will go away for the moment. It's also the case, of course, that we already have chaos. That is to say, all kinds of things have not been shipped and they're not arriving, and therefore stores don't have some of the goods and so forth that they expected. How quickly this will gear up into some kind of normalcy within the next 90 days, and what will happen afterwards is unclear. But it's certainly a good idea to have to decompressurize this whole issue to some extent and allow sensible negotiations to go on. As you know, one of the hallmark policies of the Trump administration is that we need to bring factories and production back to the United States, and that we should not be importing things which we should manufacture ourselves. There may be a modicum of truth in some areas, but basically the world economy as it now exists has a reasonably free flow of bits and pieces of productions and things, not just cars, but iPhones and everything else. So it's not, we can't envisage it as a situation where, goods either come in or they come out, and if they don't come in, then the toys won't be in the toy store. Much of international commerce nowadays is linked to productions that are combined from aspects from various countries. So that, of course, when the president says we're going to bring production back, he means all bits and pieces of the car, the computer, the television, and so forth. Well, there are a number of problems with that, and that is to say, the shiny new factories that he has in mind in the United States, first of all, will take years in many cases to develop. And second of all, factory work in the United States comprises about 10% of our labor pool. We're essentially a service economy. And we are not, a blue-collar factory economy anymore. And so the idea that what now utilizes 10% of blue-collar work is all of a sudden going to blossom into whatever, 30, 40, 50% of Americans having blue-collar jobs is a pipe dream. It makes no sense in terms of the kind of education people are getting and the amount of time that it would take to build factories. And of course, the international economy is based on comparative advantage, right? the reason that much of our clothing is produced or was produced, at least in China, and now much of it in Vietnam and Cambodia and Bangladesh and so forth, is because the labor there is cheaper. Now you can say that that's too bad. The labor there should be as highly paid as in the United States. But that's, unrealistic. That is to say, in due time, as societies develop, the labor also will have a higher income, better housing, and so forth. But if you imagine that your T-shirts are going to be produced in American factories, and your pants and your shoes and so forth, the labor cost in this country would make them prohibitively expensive, right? So the current economy, global economy, may not be perfect and requires adjustment, and there are violations that need to be addressed. But the idea that we're going to become this autonomous economy that produces all we consume inside this country makes no sense at all in terms of modern industrial production and so forth, and even under the best of circumstances would take years. So we're talking, a fair amount of nonsense here. And it is true that 2-3 years ago, 19% of Chinese exports came to the United States. Now it's already down to 15%, and the Chinese have actually been quite smart about diversification. That is to say, the Chinese, not just in terms of buying agricultural goods in Latin America, which they are doing, but the Chinese are all over Latin America, all over Africa, all over Asia, having invested in and participating in the production of things that they need for their own economies, but also what will consume their exports to those countries. So the world has not stood still in the last few years. The Chinese have rapidly diversified, are considerably less dependent on sales to the United States, are of course even 15% is still a chunk of the Chinese economy that can't be dismissed. But insofar as the Chinese have seen the writing on the wall, they have done a pretty good job of being essentially all over the world in terms of their sales, their purchases, their trade, and so forth. So this has all been happening over the years, and now, of course, we are able to say, we the United States, well, look at the Chinese economy. They're in really bad shape, and it is true that the Chinese economy is under stress, to put it mildly. Maybe on the TV or in newspapers you've read there's a housing crisis. COVID raked the Chinese economy quite a bit. People stopped buying apartments in the high-rise apartments. People during COVID and now after COVID, Chinese are very diligent about not spending too much money, so that, for example, manufactured goods are not selling as they did before COVID, because people are very conservative about their money in China, and they rather, put it in a bank or under the mattress than buy things excessively. So that the Chinese economy on its own accord, never mind the US for a minute, has slowed down, and that there are some serious problems in the Chinese economy, which the Chinese are seeking to address. So the Chinese economy is weaker than it used to be, internal to itself, right? And there is considerable unemployment in China. And not just unemployment on farmers or blue-collar workers, but also amongst the educated. Because if you don't have a developing or a growing need for people with computer skills, for people with university degrees and so forth, because your economy has slowed down, right? You all of a sudden have all kinds of young adults who are well educated finding it difficult to find jobs. So I don't want to diminish the internal problems of the Chinese, which may not have anything to do with the US or with the Trump administration policies. But I do want to say that, have the Chinese now are having sort of three balls in the air. Number one, dealing with the United States and Trump and the ridiculous tariffs of 148% or whatever, which obviously are going to go away. But we still may put 80% or 75% tariffs on Chinese goods. But so they're having the problem with the U.S. Trade policies and tariffs. They're also having problems of their own making and internal to their societies, not of their own making, that are the consequence of a slowdown of their economies in the post-COVID era. And the Chinese are also having a third set of issues, and that is their military is weak in some ways and not up to par. And why does this matter? This matters in terms of the issue of Taiwan. As you know, the Chinese want Taiwan back. And as you know, the US over the decades has been supporting Taiwan and Taiwan's independence from mainland China. So several things have happened on that front. One, it is less clear that the Trump administration will protect Taiwan if there is an invasion. And the sort of more or less 100% assurance that Taiwan had that they had American backings is now called into some question, which would mean that it would be quite timely for the Chinese now to jump and take over Taiwan while America may not interfere. So that's issue number one. If they would do that, what they would need is a military, Navy, an Air Force that is up to par to engage in a conflict with Taiwan and take it over. And various military analysts have said, actually, the Chinese military could use some shaping up, which I think the Chinese agree with. And so there is some effort right now to pay more attention to the quality and capacity and readiness of the Chinese military to engage in such an adventure. So that is is separate in a sense from the U.S. and Trump's policy, but it's not entirely separate in the sense that U.S. foreign policy and how committed we are to the protection of Taiwan also potentially leaves an opening for mainland Chinese, and that's quite dangerous, not just for the Taiwanese, but also for other Asian countries, Korea, Japan, the whole region. So things are shaky about all of this. There's nothing definitive to be said about it, but it's certainly worth raising some alarm. It is also the case that for the Chinese, climate issue is a serious business. The overwhelming majority of Chinese energy still comes from coal and oil, but the Chinese have made remarkable progress in moving into climate-friendly energy sources. The percentages of that are still relatively small compared to, let's say, some European countries, but their desire to switch and to take climate change seriously exceeds that of the United States, because as you may know, the Trump administration is not interested in climate change. He thinks it's a farce. And we're wanting to move back into oil exploration and coal mining and so forth. And for example, in today's news conference, climate change didn't even come up. It is not on Trump's agenda because he thinks it's phony baloney. Well, the Chinese are taking it seriously, and they have reasons to take it seriously. First, because they do believe in climate change, and second of all, the Chinese have only 10% of the world's arable land, while they have 20% of the world's population. Let me repeat that. The Chinese only have 10% of the world's arable land, and they have 20% of the world's population. Okay, 30% of China is desert. So, given the large population in China, and given their large desert, and given their large population, there is reason that a reasonable and coherent Chinese administration would say, yo, climate change is something we need to consider. So they're not just exporting solar panels to the United States. They are taking climate change seriously. And it's interesting that this large country of China, if anything, is taking it more seriously than, let's say, the large country of India, and or let's say Nigeria, some very large countries which should take climate change more seriously. The Chinese are in fact taking climate change seriously. So we have an authoritarian government in China. This authoritarian government which used to be fairly isolated even a few years ago. I mean, they, mucked about somewhat in Africa and Latin America, has now put itself in the position of a serious global actor, acting in, various ways on domestic politics, and domestic economic policy, but also having become really a global economic actor. In an oddity, when the US used to pride itself on that and has largely withdrawn. So, for example, the Chinese are far more active economically than the United States is in South America at the moment. And, as we know, the Monroe Doctrine, which we all learned about in school, said, this is our backyard and we're China. We've largely neglected Latin America. And the Chinese have been very busy in Latin America. And, they're not being altruistic. I mean, the Chinese have to buy Brazilian foodstuffs. They're very dependent on soya and other things from places like Brazil. But they're also minding the store in terms of setting up trade and setting up some economic capacities in Latin American countries, which make trade easier and also give Latin American countries more capacity. So if you have interdependent economic relations, you also have some political leverage, right? So in Africa, in Latin America, in all over Southeast Asia, it's not just the Road and Belt Initiative. In the Middle East, the Chinese are more or less everywhere, and often modestly so, without making many waves, but looking out for their national interests, both economically as well as politically. And here I want to raise yet another issue, and that is, of course, the US under Trump, is totally uninterested in international institutions. So institutions like the World Trade Organization, we sure don't have to pay any attention to them. We get out of the World Health Organization. We haven't paid our dues to the United Nations, our annual dues, by the way. There's an interesting factoid here. If you don't pay your dues for, I think it's a year, you can lose your voting rights in the United Nations. and we are at risk of losing our voting rights unless we pay up fairly soon. The Chinese are not particularly interested in the United Nations, but insofar as it exists, they certainly are interested in having more leverage within the United Nations Central, as well as the specialized agencies, than the US has. So our disinterest and withdrawal, essentially, here we were, the mothers and the fathers of the United Nations. The charter was signed in San Francisco. And all of these years, we were dominant supporters financially and otherwise. We're pulling back everywhere and just have no particular interest. We're the United States. We can just do whatever we want internationally. We don't particularly have to interest ourselves in these institutions. When the major power, the United States, and the major economy, like the United States, pulls out of these institutions, they are, of course, weakened. And I've spoken before about the disaster of pulling out of World Trade Organizations in terms of collecting medical information and vaccinations and all the rest of it. But that's also true even in the United Nations. And our disinterest as a country in international institutions has been noted by everyone. Which means that some countries are trying to step up and exercise more control on their own. I'm not sure that the Chinese are that interested in really stepping up and engaging more so than half the past. There isn't much evidence for that, but they certainly have more leverage than the United States because they at least claim to have some interest in it. Where then does China stand in world affairs? I think almost all countries realize it's an authoritarian country. Almost all countries in the world realize that China has domestic issues. Almost all countries in the world don't like foreigners to take over a section of their economies. And here it's worth saying that while Americans, in general, have been, as individuals, through USAID, which of course we've collapsed, have been fairly popular. We're sort of easygoing, engaged with the local population, and so forth. The Chinese, on the whole, have never been popular in countries where they have spent some time. For example, going all the way back to the 60s and 70s, the Chinese built a railroad between Zambia and the coast in Tanzania. They were also very active in a period in Ethiopia, building all kinds of things. And so they sent quite a lot of Chinese over there to work and to construct things and so forth. But the local population didn't like them. And one of the reasons they didn't like them was the Chinese essentially don't mix. That is to say, both in Tanzania and Zambia, as well as in Ethiopia, they built compounds for themselves with walls around them and raised their own vegetables and, pigs and so forth, and just sort of made themselves into little autonomous little enclaves, not conclaves, enclaves, so that they didn't really have to interact very much with the local populations. That is not to say, however, that Chinese individuals sometimes haven't settled in countries that they first visited or had some relationships. For example, in Africa, many of the little sort of 7-Eleven type places in rural areas, which among other things, have recharge systems for people's cell phones, are owned and run by Chinese. So there are individual Chinese who have made their lives in foreign countries and are not necessarily very unpopular. But the Chinese moving into countries en masse with workers and so forth has never worked out extremely well. So I don't want to sell the virtue of the Chinese as they're spread out all over the world, nor do I want to oversell the fact that as the US makes things less desirable economically to interact with China, that China will be welcomed all over the world. Chinese policy often make mistakes. Chinese policies often support the wrong indigenous political figures. After all, they're authoritarians. So the Chinese, I don't want to make the Chinese look like, the golden boys and girls in the world. But I do want to say that the Chinese have taken every possible clever advantage of the US dysfunctionality nowadays. So as the US is shrinking into itself, and the policies, especially under Trump, are trying to alienate even our friends like Canada, like the Europeans, and so forth, the Chinese see the writings on the wall and they see opportunities for themselves to step in and to come across more reasonably. One other commentary on corruption, which is rife in many societies, including our own, is, of course, the Chinese have internal corruption, right? Their elites and so forth are the beneficiaries, while other people often suffer. And we've often criticized the Chinese for that. Funny, and I'll maybe end on that part of Trump's news conference today, was his speaking of that wonderful, huge Boeing presidential airplane that he will get as a present from Qatar. And questions have been raised about the legality of that, because, as you know, there's an emolument clause in the United States. You can only accept small little gifts, not major gifts, from a foreign power. And he said today that, well, the airplane, after he ceases being president, will go to the presidential library. Presumptively, he can still use it if it's in the presidential library. But this is sort of corruption on a level that we used to accuse, China and other countries of, and is illegal in the United States. And we'll see whether he can get away from it. From that perspective, the Chinese at this point are not responding well to American criticism of their authoritarian state, and are, in a sense, saying to themselves, we've been criticized and we've had to be defensive about our international transactions around the world. Well, look at what America is doing. And maybe some countries would even prefer us to make some investments in their countries rather than Americans. And or if Americans don't make investments, we can fill a vacuum. So I think what one can say about China is not that China is somehow a good guy in the world, but China is certainly in many ways benefiting from our American policy right now and our current presidency. And while it may still be the case that they will be very much disadvantaged at the end of tariff discussions, that is, say, we will still put high tariffs on the Chinese, the fact of the matter is that the Chinese are very busy working internationally to try to cope with the situation. While to the best of our knowledge, we're not doing very much to cope with a separation from trade with China and other countries. We're simply saying we're going to do this all on our own, build factories on our own, and nobody coming from a neutral position as an economist believes that, within a year, we will have all these lovely factories which will produce all the bits and pieces of everything we import. We have built an interdependent economic world for years, and the idea that we can become an autonomous economic actor is, if anything, a dream. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again in 2 weeks.